Accountability will come to order. I want to welcome everyone here today. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. Before I recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement, I don't know if Mr. Sessions is in here or not. Okay, well, that's okay, Bill, I'll get him. I'll begin with my opening statement now, and I was going to recognize Mr. Sessions here in a moment, but this morning we're here to review how the federal government is being run. Government performance impacts all Americans in one way or another, whether it's securing the border, issuing Social Security checks, or processing student financial aid forms. The federal government is the nation's largest employer with a 2 million strong civilian workforce headquartered here in Washington, D.C. Each year, those employees administer nearly $2 trillion in grants and contracts. They operate and secure a vast network of federal information systems and perform myriad other functions to keep the government's gears turning. So who's in charge of this operation? As much as any single individual, it's today's witness, Jason Miller, the Deputy Director for Management at the White House Office of Management and Budget. The management side of OMB, which Mr. Miller leads, devises and oversees the execution of the President's management agenda. That's the blueprint for how the President wants the government run. How to manage the workforce, the contracts, the IT, and the finances. OMB works with individual federal agencies to ensure that vision is executed across the government. The government exists to serve the American people, so it should always be managed with their best interest in mind. My constituents and those of the other members of this committee want government services delivered efficiently and effectively, and they don't want to pay for unnecessary overhead. I think we can all surely agree on that. We can probably also agree that to run efficiently, any large organization today must make data-driven decisions to ensure efficiency and cost effectiveness. And the Biden administration claims to be using database management, but it's not showing its work. A prime example is telework. At the onset of the COVID pandemic, massive federal employee telework was a justifiable necessity. That necessity ended long ago. Yet massive telework continues under the Biden administration, who is intent on making it a permanent fixture of federal work life. How do we know that this is in the best interest of the public? The only data we've seen on that is a survey of federal employees themselves. They think it's working great. I'm sure they do. And it came as a surprise to committee members that when the OPM director appeared before us to testify last year, she was unable to answer basic questions about how many federal employees were going into their offices. How can telework levels be data-driven if you don't even know how many employees are teleworking? Since that OPM hearing, we've been requesting telework-related information from agencies, including what evidence they possess that agency productivity is maximized by elevated levels of telework. In other words, how are Americans benefiting from federal employees staying at home? The collective responses were limited. They gave no assurance whatsoever that these policies are data-driven or otherwise designed with the best interest of the public in mind. So what is driving them? Federal employee unions seem to be a major driver. The fact is, the President himself said 2 years ago in his State of the Union address that federal workers would return to their offices. And the White House Chief of Staff has sent a few emails to agency heads prodding them to increase in-person work. But unions have continued to push back. Half of recent union grievance cases before the Federal Service Impasses Panel dealt with telework or similar workplace issues like hoteling or shared workspaces in federal offices. The administration often speaks of empowering federal workers and their unions, and it has taken tangible steps to increase the strength of these unions. Well, they seem to have some muscle, and it's being flexed to resist the limited, belated attempts the administration has made to get government employees back to work. To be clear, it's not just federal employee unions that the White House caters to in its management agenda. Unions operating in the private sector are also benefiting at the public's expense. We see that in the way federal contract dollars are being managed. For instance, the White House issued an executive order requiring federal contracting agencies to mandate project labor agreements, or PLAs, on federal construction projects worth $35 million or more. PLAs essentially require that union workers perform all labor on a project. This discriminates against the non-union majority of the construction workforce, and it drives up project costs to taxpayers by 12 to 20%. By one estimate, this PLA policy will impact at least 180 federal construction projects valued at $16 billion. In December, OMB issued a memo concerning the PLA executive order, and our witness today, Mr. Miller, was among the White House officials who met last month with major union representatives at a roundtable on PLAs. I'm glad Mr. Miller is taking the time to meet with us today to have this important discussion where we can work together to ensure that our government is being well managed. With that, I now yield to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Did you want to go to Mr. Sessions first?
Thank you. Before I yield to Ranking Member Raskin, I want to take a moment to offer my condolences to our colleague, Chairman Sessions, on the loss of his district director, and more importantly, his longtime friend, Kevin Burnett. I learned of Kevin's passing yesterday, and I know it came as a shock to you, Mr. Sessions, your staff, and all those who knew Kevin. So on behalf of this committee, I want to offer my thoughts and prayers to you, and especially Kevin's wife, Pat, and his daughters, Anna Grace and Callie.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Burnett and I have been friends with each other since 1976. He served as our district director with honor and distinction, with balance and grace. And while none of us saw this coming, the good Lord stepped into Kevin on Sunday night, and we are all in shock. And I want to thank you and my colleagues who've all expressed to me the loss not only of a district director, but a dear, 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 great and good, fine young man. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll be thinking of you, Pete. Now, Chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Raskin, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on behalf of the minority, Mr. Sessions, we want to send you our sympathy and our love on the untimely loss of Mr. Burnett. And I never had the opportunity to meet him, but he sounds like just an extraordinary and wonderful man. And we know you've lost not just your district chief, but a close friend, and so our hearts are with you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Deputy Director Miller, for appearing today. OMB sets the policies that guide executive branch agencies on how to spend the money that Congress appropriates. It's OMB that turns administration policy priorities into the direct service of our constituents and our communities. So what we're talking about today is the essential mechanics of how the federal government works and how it should work, how to ensure that government services reach all eligible recipients, how to prevent and detect and reduce improper access to federal programs, and how to recruit and maintain the safety of the 2 million plus people across America who comprise the largest and most diversely talented and skilled workforce in our country. Under the Biden-Harris administration, OMB has made excellent strides in modernizing and revitalizing a federal government that was demoralized and gutted after 4 years of undermining and mismanagement. When he was in office, ex-President Trump used OMB not as the transmission belt for getting government services to the people, but as the instrument for personal vendettas against enemies in the public sector workforce as a whole. As Deputy Director Miller affirms in his testimony today, OMB is now using data and feedback from stakeholders across America to ensure that its guidance is always rooted in facts and the demands of pragmatic public policy, not ideological litmus tests and political loyalty tests. OMB's guidance and policies today are transforming how we interact with government. OMB is improving how our communities access federal funding, including grants and loans. It's ensuring that federal agencies use artificial intelligence equitably and ethically. OMB is setting excellent government-wide policies on recruiting and retaining a qualified federal workforce. Federal workers provide medical care to veterans, they respond to natural disasters, and they ensure the safety of the nation's food supply. They show up every day to provide essential services, and OMB is transforming the way the federal workforce thinks about serving the people and improving access to government programs and services. Here's a great example of the kind of innovation that's taking place. The IRS has launched the incredibly successful direct file pilot, which allows taxpayers in several states to easily and quickly file their taxes directly with the IRS at no cost. The trick is that the IRS guides you through filling out your Form 1040 with all of your basic W-2 information, which is the major or only income that most people have to report. Taxpayers with additional questions about direct file access customer service representatives directly for help. But in other words, the government comes to act as your tax preparer. People should not have to pay exorbitant fees to private companies for help filing a straightforward tax return. OMB is leading other similar government-wide efforts to reduce the cost and frustration of interacting with government. I look forward to the day, soon I hope, when we will have direct file for the whole country and people will be able to open up a note from the IRS with their tax forms pre-populated. That's information that the government has. Another critical way that individuals, businesses, and communities interact with government is through the federal grants process. In fiscal year 2024 thus far, for example, state and local government entities, nonprofits, and local businesses in Texas, for example, received more than $29 billion in grants just from the Department of Health and Human Services. Despite all these investments, the reporting requirements and the complicated process required to secure federal funding have slowed down access and innovation and kept many communities from getting critical funding. But OMB's updated guidance puts grant applicants, the people who are elected, who we are elected to serve, in the driver's seat and adapts the capabilities of today's technology to modern-day constituent expectations. When OMB announced this new guidance last month, the chief of the Division of Fiscal Management for Montgomery County, Maryland, which I represent, spoke at the event and said, quote, "Plain language, accessible information, and reduction in burdensome closeout requirements allows for those of us in local government to have broader and clearer conversations on grant implementation through our organizations." As I'm sure the distinguished chairman can confirm, residents from Kentucky have also appreciated and lauded this new guidance, along with my constituents in Maryland. In the comment process for this new guidance, I noticed a consultant from Fort Knox who helps museums, zoos, parks, and other cultural centers, who commented that the new guidance would reduce the burdens placed on nonprofits, allowing them to devote energies more toward doing the work that directly fulfills their missions. The National Council of Nonprofits said the OMB's new guidance is welcomed by the nonprofit community, particularly the improvements that reduce administrative burdens and require agencies to use plain language. Other nonprofit groups welcomed OMB's updated guidance as well. I look forward to hearing more today about how OMB has modernized and updated its grants guidance to simplify the process for all of the communities and constituents that we serve. I also look forward to hearing from Deputy Director Miller about how we can work together to make federal programs even more effective by preventing fraud and waste in federal spending. Earlier this month, I was proud to introduce the Government Spending Oversight Act of 2024, which would make more permanent the Inspector General community's ability to identify and to ferret out fraud in federal programs. Also, very importantly, I want to highlight the vital role that a nonpartisan, merit-based federal workforce plays for our country. The rejected Schedule F proposal would remove experts and replace them with an army of sycophants, and that proposal would disproportionately affect OMB's workforce. Under the ex-president's plan, nearly 70% of our non-political workforce could have been fired simply because they did their jobs and followed their oath to defend the Constitution. Although President Biden has taken steps to prevent a future similar attack on our civil service, we cannot forget that an expert and nonpartisan federal workforce is essential to a functioning democratic government. With that, I look forward to hearing testimony this morning from Deputy Director Miller. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member yields back. Today we are joined by Jason Miller, the Deputy Director for Management at the Office of Management and Budget, where he serves as the federal government's Chief Operating Officer. In this role, Mr. Miller coordinates management initiatives touching on all aspects of government operations, including but not limited to personnel and telework policies, grants management, procurement, agency IT modernization, and agency use of artificial intelligence. Prior to his role in the Biden White House, Mr. Miller served on the National Economic Council in the Obama administration. Pursuant to Committee Rule 9G, the witness will please stand and raise his right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show the witness answered in the affirmative. Thank you. You may take a seat. We certainly appreciate you being here, Mr. Miller, and look forward to your testimony. Let me remind the witness that we have read your opening statement, and it will appear in full in the hearing record. Please limit your oral statement to 5 minutes. As a reminder, please press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it is on and the members can hear you. When you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green. After 4 minutes, the light will turn yellow. When the red light comes on, your 5 minutes have expired. We would ask that you please wrap it up. I now recognize Deputy Director Miller for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Comer, Ranking Member Raskin, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. As a Deputy Director for Management at the Office of Management and Budget, I am responsible for overseeing government-wide management matters and ensuring that the federal government has the tools and processes to deliver for the American people. Upon taking office, the Biden-Harris administration confronted historic crises, a raging pandemic and an economy that had lost millions of jobs, requiring strong, immediate execution by federal agencies while they strengthened and rebuilt. In response, this administration has focused our management efforts on strengthening the federal workforce, improving service delivery and customer experience, and protecting taxpayer funds. First, federal government's most important asset in delivering performance is its people, its workforce. Federal civil servants across the nation have chosen to serve our country, but too often, public discourse politicizes government personnel to the detriment of government performance, which in turn negatively impacts the American people they serve. For effective performance, we also need strong and healthy organizations. That is why last April, OMB issued guidance calling for agencies to substantially increase meaningful in-person work at federal offices, particularly at headquarters and equivalents. Federal agencies are moving towards a posture where telework-eligible teams are working in person at the office at least half of their hours. OMB will continue to push agencies to complete implementation. Second, most Americans experience their government through the services that federal agencies deliver. Under President Biden, the administration has established the importance of simple, secure customer experiences. We have made substantial progress, but significant work remains. OMB's role includes driving an annual improvement process for our largest service providers. Amongst many actions, over the last year, the administration has made it easier for Americans to file their taxes, reducing wait times on call lines from 28 minutes in 2022 to just 3 minutes this year, and piloting Direct File, a new, free, and simple digital solution for tax filing. Issued the highest numbers of passports in a year while bringing the service commitment back down to pre-pandemic norms, and piloting online passport renewals. Reduced paperwork burdens for farmers applying for loans to USDA by more than half, and expanding the VA app so millions of veterans have simpler, more accessible tools to obtain health and benefit services. Third, the Biden-Harris administration has worked to ensure taxpayers get the best bang for their buck. On federal procurement, our efforts have resulted in more than $40 billion in savings and cost avoidance. And OMB launched the Better Contracting Initiative, which we estimate will result in at least $10 billion more per year in savings and cost avoidance. On program integrity, the administration has taken significant action to address the fraud we inherited in pandemic relief programs. Those actions included reinstalling basic controls, rebuilding the relationship with the oversight community, and strengthening systems to prevent fraud. These actions, combined with the President's comprehensive anti-fraud proposal, would have prevented a substantial amount of the fraud experienced early in the pandemic. On federal financial assistance, earlier this month, OMB announced an overhaul of the Uniform Grants Guidance to streamline requirements on federal funds, cutting red tape so recipients focus on outcomes, not overhead, while strengthening the ability to safeguard these funds. On Made in America, OMB created a first-ever Made in America office, increased the share of federal procurement to domestic workers and businesses, and implemented Build America, Buy America requirements, which expand domestic content requirements to all federal infrastructure. As part of the President's strategy to strengthen domestic manufacturing and supply chains, this approach is working, with more than $600 billion in private investment to American manufacturing. And enabling all this work requires modern and secure technology systems. OMB has worked to accelerate the retirement and migration of legacy IT systems, strengthen technical talent in federal agencies, raise standards for cybersecurity through OMB's Zero Trust strategy, and prepare agencies to harness the opportunities and mitigate the risks of artificial intelligence. We have delivered real results for the American people, but there's much more work to do. I look forward to continuing to work with Congress across these management priorities.
Thank you. Now we'll begin the questioning phase of the hearing. I recognize Mr. Grofman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Thank you. A while back, I had a staff relieve me, really a sharp guy, and I asked him for comments on what we could do to improve the office. And like a lot of offices, we went through a period of telework, during the COVID. And he was critical of it. He felt he was a great worker, as good as he could be, but with you at home, sometimes the kids are around, sometimes the dog's around, it's hard to really be honest and say you're getting as much done as you would be without it. In your opinion, is widespread federal telework as effective, efficient, and good for the taxpayers' in-person work?
Congressman, thank you. And as you noted, it was an important tool during the pandemic to navigate through that for some of the federal workforce. It's important to put in context the federal workforce. About half of federal workers have to be at a work site to perform their job responsibilities.
Right.
Our approach in early 2023 was to release guidance to agencies to substantially increase the amount of in-person work. The purpose of that approach was to strengthen teams and organizations, make sure that we had strong culture, make sure that we had innovative teams, make sure that we were able to bring people on board. For office workers, the place where there's consistency across different agencies, we've been clear that our expectation is agencies are achieving at least 50% while giving them flexibility for how to deliver based upon their diverse mission space. That's consistent with where the private sector is, and we're going to continue to adjust as needed. We should compete for talent. We should be able to measure performance.
Okay. So you're saying a good target is half the people going to work every day?
Our expectation is for office workers,
Right.
headquarters and equivalents, that agencies are achieving at least 50%. To the extent they want to adjust to levels above that, we give them that flexibility. We set that target because it's consistent with where the private sector is. We think given where the market is, that's the right answer.
I'll ask you again. Do you feel federal telework is effective, efficient, and good for the taxpayer as in-person work, in your own opinion?
I think that agencies have the ability to deliver on effective and efficient
You don't want
telework.
to answer the question. The White House Chief of Staff, Jeff Zients, sent an email to cabinet leadership in August 2023 calling for agency heads to aggressively increase in-person work, stating that doing so is a priority for President Biden. His email said that doing so would allow the executive branch to deliver better results for the American people by improving teamwork and productivity. Does Mr. Zients' email imply that teamwork and productivity within the federal workforce had been negatively impacted by widespread telework?
Thank you. The rationale for our approach to substantially increase in-person work was because we believed an amount of in-person work is critical for healthy teams. We've seen that in the private sector. We want that in our organizations going forward. We're trying to also make sure that leadership is focused on it, so it's not a check-the-box exercise. We want to make sure at least half of hours for comparable work is in person based upon what we see in the market and what we've seen on the evolving research. We think that's the right answer. That balances the flexibility, that gives strength to our teams, that increases employee engagement, allows us to compete for talent.
So that's a permanent state of affairs now for the federal government. Half, your average guy, or I'll say even management, where I think it's even more relevant. Is your policy for management of teams that they're there half the time and half the time they don't have to be?
Our policy is for agencies to achieve at least and make sure that
Well,
they're
again,
adjusting.
I'll narrow it down to management positions. I mean, in my opinion, it's more important for management to be there than someone else. Okay, so then management is kind of overlooking things. Are you satisfied if management only comes in half the time?
Our focus is making sure that agencies have policies that are geared towards performance. If being in person more for the management team improves their performance, that's exactly what they should do.
Okay. I mentioned that the last email from Mr. Zients was January 19, 2024, pretty late in the game. Do you feel that your progress towards getting people back to work in person is slower than desired? I mean, it seems to me like the COVID is ancient history right now. And I think that email dated January 2024, kind of recent. Does it imply that things are going slower than your expectations were?
We expect agencies to completely follow through on their implementation, and we will hold them accountable for that.
Okay. I'll just make one more comment. I do feel that in government, sometimes they don't realize the degree to which in the private sector, in many areas, everybody was back to work, okay? And when I go home at night, it's kind of a stereotype, but I got Wisconsin. I got all these cheese factories I drive by, depending upon which way I go home. They were all packed even at 1 o'clock in the morning, you know? So I just want to emphasize that I think in many private sector jobs, they were showing up at work in the teeth of the epidemic, and the time for we should be back to where we want to be. Thank you.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Raskin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The government distributes $1.2 trillion a year in grants and loans through thousands of different programs that go out to the states and localities and tribal governments. All of us have constituents who benefit from federal grant money going to fire safety, healthcare, domestic violence programs, after-school programs, and so on. Traditionally, it's been very difficult to apply to get this money. The application process has been opaque, elusive, inscrutable, incomprehensible, poorly written, lots of unnecessary administrative burdens and so on. But earlier this month, you announced significant updates to the OMB's Uniform Grants Guidance process. And we've been getting rave reviews from different parts of the country about this. Tell us, what are the changes that you've made to the Uniform Grants process to make it more transparent and accessible to the mayors and the county commissioners and the people who end up applying for a lot of this money?
Ranking Member Raskin, thank you for the question, and we were appreciative of having a Montgomery County resident speak at our event. OMB doesn't typically hold events when we announce new government-wide policy. We had about 10,000 people join on this event, and we had a packed room, over 150 people in the room, given the broad excitement across every single state. The first thing we did was completely overwrite the grants guidance in plain language. Why does that matter? Agencies were interpreting specific components of it in different ways. So that meant a recipient who had grants from 2 different places was getting 2 sets of requirements from 2 different agencies on the same words. Or agencies were layering on compliance requirements that was discouraging people from ever even applying for federal funds. The second thing is we're using this overhaul to also change our approach to notices of funding opportunities, NOFOs. We're trying to dramatically simplify them. We should give out dollars to the organizations that can best deliver on outcomes, not the organizations that can afford experts who can best fill out the paperwork to apply for those grants.
Is this going to help communities that have been traditionally underserved?
Absolutely.
Why?
We expect it will. We think the simplification of the process will open the door to more organizations. We like to say we want the dollars to focus on outcomes, not overhead. That will bring in more organizations who've traditionally thought that government funding was not an available resource for them. We have tried to make clear requirements from agencies to simplify. And by the way, we did this with the oversight community. So this was done in a way to also strengthen the safeguards we have in place while broadening the pool of potential applicants.
The Schedule F proposal would permit the president to replace career government workers and experts with political loyalists. Can you discuss what the return of Schedule F could do to the civil service and how it would affect the services to our people?
Ranking Member Raskin, thank you. This is an important topic, again, for well-performing organizations, whether in the private sector or the public sector. The most important thing is its workforce. We have, for 140 years, had an approach focused on experience and expertise, a merit-based system. Schedule F would have undermined that very system. We want to make sure that the people within our agencies bring experience and expertise irrespective of their personal political views or who sits in the White House so that we can deliver. We have leaders in positions that are the decision makers. The workforce is accountable to their managers and to the leaders. The approach that we have taken, the first week the president reversed that through executive order, would strengthen. The return of Schedule F would have a significant chilling effect on our ability to retain and to recruit talent in a broad range of spaces, including critical skill areas the federal government badly needs.
Finally, I'm looking at some data from the Congressional Budget Office, which shows that percentage of employees who typically work from home is actually higher in the private sector than in the federal government, although they're comparable to each other, something around, it looks like around 20 or 25%, but both have been declining since COVID. Is that right?
I'm not familiar with the specifics. Again, about half of the federal government doesn't even have the opportunity to telework based upon their job requirements. There are some workers who are telework eligible that do not because it is not in the best interest of their teams and their organizations.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Palmer from Alabama for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miller, Federal News Network surveys of over 6,300 federal employees. Only 6% were entirely in office. There was an article in the last few days that showed that the Department of Agriculture has space for 7,400 employees, but only 456 are actually coming into work. That's 6%. It's consistent with what the Federal News Network survey found. OMB put out a memo encouraging people to come back to work, basically saying that you wanted purposeful, well-planned in-person work. President Biden put out a memo telling people to return to the office. Why hasn't that been implemented?
Thank you, Congressman. It's important that our agencies have policies.
No, that's not. I'm not going to let you lobby. I want you to do your job. I want you to answer questions. And the question I ask is, why haven't those policies been implemented? I don't want you to try to filibuster this.
Agencies are currently implementing. Where we are today as a federal government, again, 50% of our workforce is not eligible for telework based upon where they are. We measure.
Then why are only 6% of
agencies are required to measure hours. Part of our guidance told agencies that they have to have monitoring systems in place.
Okay, why are there only 456 employees showing up at the Department of Agriculture?
I would have to direct you to USDA about their specific numbers.
Okay, well, let me ask you something else. In 2019, Congress enacted the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, otherwise known as the Open Government Data Act. That's 5 years ago that was enacted, and it was to make government transparent and accessible to public and private sector interests. But yet, here we are 5 years later, we still don't have the implementing guidance from OMB. for Title II, the Open Government Data Act. What accounts for the delay in releasing the guidance?
Congressman, we take the implementation of the Evidence Act seriously. We've made a lot of progress. I have a team that reports to me that focuses on
5
strengthening
years?
evidence.
Is that because you don't have enough people in the office, or you're just incompetent?
Congressman, again,
You
evidence.
haven't implemented it in 5 years.
Congressman,
I bet this committee, Mr. Chairman, I bet we could write this in just a matter of days, the implementation guidance. But 5 years later, you haven't done it. Why?
Congressman, again, we have been implementing the Evidence Act. Be happy to follow up with you with concerns with respect to the guidance specifically. We've been strengthening evidence building in agencies. We've launched learning agendas, both for our management agenda and with agencies to bring in research to evaluate programs in terms of transparency on
Can you
government
give me
performance.
a date? Can you give me a date, a specific date that OMB will finalize and release the guidance?
I'd be happy to take that back and get back to you, Congressman.
Okay, will you get back to us in writing, via email, text message? You're going to run an
I'd
ad?
be
What are you
happy
going
to
to
take
do?
that back and follow up with you, yes.
All right, I want to ask you something else about this. I mean, I've sat here now and watched the federal government issue regulations, just a deluge of regulations and guidance, which is basically lawmaking, bypassing Congress, yet 5 years later, you still haven't been able to get the guidance written for a bill that we passed in 2019. I also want to ask you about, did OMB provide a strategic plan outlining the ways OMB would comply with Executive Order 14019? Yeah, are you familiar with that?
Not by the number, Congressman.
It's an executive order directs or mobilize voters and submit their plans directly to the White House. Is OMB engaging in a voter turnout effort? Maybe I should put it that way.
Got it. Thank you, Congressman. I'm going to have to take that back. I'm not familiar with the specifics.
That's something I think we need to do additional work on, Mr. Chairman. It appears that we're using federal resources for voter turnout efforts for the president. I yield back.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Chair now recognizes Mr. Litch from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miller, thank you for your willingness to come before this committee and help us with our work. So let's talk telework first. We've often been urged to have government work more like the private sector for a very long time. And we've seen in the private sector that the shift to telework, working from home, has transformed much of the business community in the private sector in major cities like New York City, Boston, Chicago, to the degree that 25% of the office space now in New York City is vacant because the private sector sees the value in working from home, and so they're capitalizing on that. They don't need all this expensive space now, and so they're operating more efficiently. This is the private sector, the private sector. In Boston, 23% vacancy rates in expensive office space with workers working from home. Is that something that the government might take a lesson from in terms of having workers work more efficiently from home?
In crafting our government-wide guidance, we have followed very closely the research and actions by the private sector. Ultimately, we need to compete for talent. Right now, we have a major effort underway in trying to implement AI and strengthen our use of AI in the federal government. That's going to require competing with the private sector for talent. We have, in crafting our approach, we want to give flexibility to agencies based upon their diverse mission needs. But absolutely, we need to compete. And right now, the research suggests that where we're landing is the right answer. But of course, we're going to be dynamic going forward.
That's great. Let's switch over to project labor agreements. We've had project labor agreements in this country for a long, long time. The Hoover Dam one of the largest, it was the largest construction project in the history of this country at the time. The Hoover Dam was a PLA. And the challenge for the authority building that project was to get as many workers as possible who were skilled. It was sort of a remote location. They had to get as many workers there. They wanted to have no stoppages, no work stoppages. They wanted to have high-quality construction. And it was a multi-year project. This thing went on for 7 or 8 years. And so the PLA model was a huge success in that project. And then the government started using it other big and complex projects. As a union iron worker and a former union president, I've been involved in multiple projects that have used PLAs. Not just the government, but the private sector as well. When I know this new Intel chip plant out in Ohio is using a PLA to get as many workers as possible, and they've had great success there in recruiting workers. What are the advantages of using a PLA for the federal government?
Yeah, the federal government is a big buyer of large construction projects. And the simplest version is PLAs for public sector projects have been shown to bring down costs over time. It guarantees access to skilled talent. It meets the time requirements on projects. You don't have cost overruns at the same rate. It's just smart business for us to focus on encouraging agencies to leverage and utilize PLAs. I was in Cleveland with Congresswoman Brown announcing this effort on a $48 million construction project overhauling a major federal building in downtown Cleveland using a PLA, which was done because we believe it will lower the cost of the project and deliver the project on time.
And in a long-term project, talking about apprenticeship programs, wouldn't that give a worker working on a 2 or 3 year project an opportunity to complete an apprenticeship program? So not only have they been employed for 3 years, but at the end of that 3 years, they're a journey person. They're a young man or a young woman, or maybe not so young, but coming out with a skill that can be redeployed and provide for a great career and a great quality of life.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a win-win.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Higgins from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller, I'm going to reference the Biden Executive Order 14063 from February 2022. Use of project labor agreements for federal construction projects. That's what we're going to discuss. Earlier you stated you weren't familiar with the executive order by number, so I'm just clarifying. We're talking about the Biden administration's mandate for federal projects over $35 million to use labor unions. You're familiar?
I am.
Okay, good. You believe in state sovereignty, good sir? I'm quite sure you're a proud American.
I am a proud American.
Thank you very much. We're happy to hear that. Do you believe in state sovereignty? Do you recognize the sovereignty of our states?
Yes.
Absolutely. So how would you, in your position as a high officer within the Biden administration, responsible for administering work and labor policies, how do you balance an executive order that mandates federal projects moving forward within the sovereign states use labor unions when 24 of our states, like Louisiana, is a right-to-work state, have specific laws or existing executive orders within that state, specifically forbidding a mandate for projects to use labor unions? How do you balance an executive order? You're a proud American. You believe in state sovereignty. You've stated that. How would you support an executive order that overrides state sovereignty?
The specifics of the executive order directed the FAR Council.
I've read it.
So the FAR Council issued a rule encouraging PLAs. It is not a mandate. It is intended to promote competition.
It's most certainly a mandate. We're not going to get into the weeds about that. It's going to be argued in court, and we're going to win. But in the meantime, the Biden administration has effectively shut down large federal projects that had been long planned, permitted, authorized, and funded within 24 of our sovereign states. It's a massive transfer of wealth from red states, not just to blue states, but actually to labor unions within the blue states in an election year. We're going to sue. Many states are coming together. We're going to sue. We're going to win. You know we're going to win. The Biden administration knows we're going to win. But in the meantime, billions and billions of dollars will be transferred from red states, not just to blue states, but to labor unions and their entire organization machine within those blue states. Do you know, sir? You should know. You know that about 80% of the American workforce is not union affiliated? What do you have to say to those 8 out of 10 American workers that can't work in these jobs in these 24 states or elsewhere? What do you say to them?
Congressman, the rulemaking encourages competition. It does not mandate that a construction project cannot move forward.
Oh, you're a talking point fella. Listen, I'm an American, you're an American. I'm an Army veteran. Are you a veteran?
I'm not, sir.
Or are you one of the civilians that I serve and protect?
I appreciate your service.
So this is just two Americans talking. What do you tell one of the 80% of American workforce that no longer qualifies to work on billions of dollars worth of federal projects? What do you tell that man? I'm not asking you, Jamie. I'm asking Mr. Miller.
I want every single American to have access to skills and a high-quality job.
That's your answer? You want every American to have a high-quality job?
Again, sir.
That's a talking point.
Congressman.
How do you respond to the family that cannot work? You know what's going to happen? The federal government going to push these states too far. If I was a governor, I would seize those projects and put them 100% under the sovereignty of my state. Would remove the federal government from the formula completely. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Very good. Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Brown from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As part of its duties, the Office of Management and Budget oversees the annual release of the President's budget, which includes funding and direction for the entire federal workforce. The federal government is the largest employer in the United States, with over 10,000 employees alone in my district of Ohio's 11th congressional district. As a result, the administration has a significant amount of leverage to promote changes in the workforce, making it more reflective for people of all backgrounds. Opportunities like remote or telework help increase diversity in the federal workforce for people who face all types of barriers, like access to transportation, taking care of an aging relative, or having to pick up their children from school. We are living in a post-pandemic 21st century, and we should make the most of the incredible advantages technology provides us all. As you said in your testimony, Deputy Director Miller, and I quote, "It is in the interest of the American people to ensure that federal jobs are attractive so that they can be filled by dedicated individuals with experience and expertise." So, Deputy Director, can you speak to how the federal government is competing for younger, diverse employees of all backgrounds with opportunities like telework and other aspects of hybrid work?
Great, Congressman. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
And thank you for that question. We're competing for talent. We increasingly need a set of highly technical skills as one area that we're competing. Also, our federal workforce is older than the workforce overall. We've been particularly focused on increasing early career talent in the federal workforce. We've grown that by 13%, but we still have a long way to go. One of the ways that we are doing that is by trying to broaden the access to broader pools, broader talent pipelines across all of the country. If we're leaving some of the country on the bench and not giving them access, we're missing out on potential skills and expertise that could serve the American people in these roles. OPM recently took action to encourage skills-based hiring within federal agencies. That's also a shift that is happening in the private sector, so that we're moving away from purely degree attainment as a proof point for accessing jobs to, do you have the skills to do the work and the ability and the energy to come in and serve people? We want, ultimately, the president says this, our federal government should reflect the people that it serves. And frankly, I believe that that would strengthen our performance on an ongoing basis.
Thank you for that. On June 25th, 2021, President Biden signed the executive order on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in the federal workforce. As part of the executive order, the president directed the Office of Management and Budget to develop and issue a government-wide diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility strategic plan, and consistent with merit system principles, identify strategies to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and eliminate barriers to equity in federal workforce functions. So, Deputy Director Miller, can you speak to the progress on these efforts and how the Biden-Harris administration is working to further diversity in the federal workforce?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Congresswoman. Again, making sure that we have access to a broader set of talent within our federal agencies will strengthen federal agencies. One of the places that we have also focused is on utilizing internships as a real pathway to bring people in. Recently, OPM finalized Pathways regulation. That's the premier internship program with a major focus on increasing paid internships within the federal government. That gives people from all backgrounds the ability to take on these roles, and we are encouraging and creating platforms for agencies to hire interns across agencies so that open roles can be filled by people who have proven their skills in an internship.
Thank you. As a result of the executive order, you issued a memorandum last year to the heads of executive departments and agencies, encouraging them to expand access to a diverse and resilient base of U.S. business suppliers for the federal government. I applaud this step to advance our national interest by promoting businesses which have been marginalized and yet provide essential, overlooked resources. So how long has the Office of Management and Budget created a, quote, diverse and resilient marketplace for American small businesses? And finally, with my remaining time, I would yield you an opportunity to address any other questions my colleagues presented. Great challenge for you.
Thank you. On small businesses, when the president announced this yesterday, we achieved our goal of highest small business procurement on record, highest small disadvantaged business procurement on record. That's important because our supply base has been declining over the last 10 years, and we want that diversity in our supply base so that we don't get locked in to the same set of contractors on an ongoing basis, and we can make sure that we're high performing. We've got work to do, but we've made real progress and hit our goals thus far.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the chairman of the Government Operations Subcommittee, Mr. Sessions from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mr. Miller, I greeted you, and you greeted me very warmly when you came in, and thank you very much. I stated to you that I felt like today might be some opportunity for us to provide you feedback and you us, but I would not like the time to go by without saying that you and I agreed that we need to get together on really specifics, that some of the conversation that's around here, for instance, whether we're looking for younger, diverse workforce rather than qualified workforce. We're talking about all sorts of things that deal with internships, bringing people in even though they really don't fit and can't do the job. Exhibit A of that would be 18F, an organization within the GSA that came in of hiring young people to a job for them to seek out what kind of opportunities would be in the government. And what happened was they created a front part to login.gov that assured people that the person who signed in would be who they were based upon biometrics and other identifiers that they would qualify people. The IRS counted on it, the Social Security counted on it, and all sorts of other people. It was fraud. Last year we had a hearing that was members of this committee on the Republican and Democratic side filleted the government for this kind of mission that they would bring people in under these, instead of being qualified, they would bring them in as internships and finding ways to get diversity and equity and inclusion. And this is not howdy-doody time, Mr. Miller. This is a direct conversation that you're having with members of Congress that happens on a regular basis, whether it's about passports, the IRS, or other areas of running the government. I don't want to pick on your words. I told you I did not want to do that, and I will not. But this is not something where you can say, in my opinion, that you've met your goals when, in fact, the time at the Social Security office is well over an hour, the IRS well over an hour, hundreds of billions of dollars that this Congress gave to the IRS, this administration, to fix problems. Now, at the end of 4 years, we are struggling across the government. And what do we hear back? We hear back, well, we're meeting our goals. Well, if that's the best that can be done, that's why you and I had conversation up front. I think you've got to do better. I think to simply offer a parity that you do the same things like the private sector, I think that's wholly inadequate. And I had those conversations with the young ambassador from the passport agency who did a great job on behalf of not just this administration, but the American people when they turned around a disastrous circumstance that was built upon diversity, equity, and inclusion, was based on we'll shut down these areas and just go to a part-time workforce. Mr. Miller, I think you've got a big job, and I respect that. Mr. Miller, I think that you need to head back to the White House at some point today and say, I don't think our plan was well received up on the Hill. And the reason why it was not is because the American people talk to us every day. And during the last 8 or 9 hearings that my subcommittee has held, it has been a bipartisan tap dance on the face of every single administration official who chose to come forward. So we would like to put you on notice again. We think you can do better. If they're meeting the goals that you had established, you need to reassess that because the goals are not good to the American people. Lastly, I spent 16 years in the private sector. If we did not achieve what we needed to do, we were replaced. We did not ever do that with part-time people. We did it with qualified applicants who understood what the American people would want and need. Lastly, there's a lot of conversation here about post-pandemic. Well, in Texas, we had people die also, and I'm very sorry as COVID happened, but we went back to work. And we went back to work, and that's why we're the hustle and bustle state that we are, that is growing exponentially, as a matter of fact, too fast. And I would suggest to you that some of these areas are more interested in trying to deal with internal problems that came from elected people rather than serving the people who they have. So, Mr. Miller, I look forward to you and I getting together. I want to thank you for your time today. I tried not to make this personal, but what I would say is I think this administration going all the way up to the top needs to re-examine and look at their policies that are causing the outcome. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Lee from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My community, like so many others across the country, relies on federal money for vital investments. Through these federal funded grants, we can see federal ideas and support actual work on the local level to improve our constituents' livelihood. We know that improvements to infrastructure, affordable housing, STEM, innovation, clean air and clean water, good paying jobs, food insecurity, and so much more can be addressed, or at least we can begin to address them through federal grants. I'm proud of my local research institutions like Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh for bringing hundreds of millions of dollars back to the community to perform groundbreaking research. But we can't forget the equally important smaller organizations that often have difficulty in getting and accessing federal funding. Some of these smaller organizations have difficulty using the grant money because they're subjected to unexpected costs and requirements that aren't disclosed in the beginning. The financial cost of cutting through some of this red tape can be too big of a burden for so many. OMB directs agencies' processes for administering grant applications and reporting requirements. And as I've heard in my community, the process was in serious need of an overhaul. Thankfully, it seems that the process for receiving and reporting on federal funding is changing. Last month, OMB announced its new uniform grants guidance. So, Mr. Miller, what other changes to the grant-making process are in the new guidance, and how will they improve the process overall?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question, and you highlighted a number of the reasons why we took on this overhaul, rewriting it from the bottom up. The goal very much was, if we're giving out dollars to recipients, those dollars should be focused on delivering outcomes, not on low value add or no value add compliance requirements. As I noted to Ranking Member Raskin, we had agencies interpreting the same words in the guidance in multiple ways, which creates confusion, and it discourages potential organizations that would be the best at delivering on those dollars for the outcomes that we're trying to deliver from even applying. And we wanted to change that. Going forward, one of our major efforts, we're pushing very hard on federal agencies to implement this guidance by the end of this fiscal year. That will be a sprint. We're also working with federal agencies to overhaul how they do their grant announcements, their notices of funding opportunity, to simplify them, to make them clearer, to all be written in plain language. Those are things that should be no-brainers, but it's a really important. And again, we have had overwhelming positive feedback. We had over 6,000 comments when we put this out, and the comments, if I could sum them up, mostly were long overdue, thank you. We have work to do to implement. Guidance isn't a light switch, but I'm excited about where this can head, and we need to continue to execute.
Thank you. Another challenge that I'm seeing in my community is the timelines getting in the way. So when a project is time sensitive, even when a grant has been approved, sometimes the groups don't receive the funding with enough time to actually implement them. So I'm wondering, will the new grant process change? When the new grant process changes, will they improve how quickly the organizations receive their grant money?
We have set up a council of the key federal financial assistance officials across agencies so that we can improve on those kinds of processes, and that we can make sure that we're doing a better job of gathering feedback from recipients into the process. Ultimately, our approach is to make sure that we're getting more efficiency out of the dollars that we're spending, the dollars that we're giving out to these organizations. And I think it has the potential to be a big win, but we need to execute.
Okay. So I would say we also have to stay focused on eliminating the barriers that many of the families, communities, and businesses encounter when they're trying to access those resources. That means meeting people where they're at, wherever that might be. So finally, potential recipients who don't speak English as a first language, for instance, will have the opportunity to access the funding that their communities needs. How will the new guidance help diverse districts, for instance, like mine, and underserved communities access federal dollars?
So you noted one of the changes, which is removing the requirement that applications or notices be in English, to the extent that that is important in some communities in the United States, including, for example, in Puerto Rico. The other is by simplifying the overall approach and changing the way in which we do things like indirect costs. It will broaden the set of community-based organizations in particular, we believe, that will seek to access federal funding.
Thank you. Thank you for your time, and I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Director Miller. I want to talk to you about Executive Order 14019 and your involvement in the implementation of that. Does OMB have a strategic plan to implement that executive order? And if you need me to characterize what it is, I suspect you know. But
Congressman, one of your fellow congressmen has asked me the same question, and I said I would come back on the specifics. That's not been a focus of mine.
so there is a plan, and you just have to get it to us, or you don't know of a plan, or what's the situation?
Again, I'm going to take that back and make sure that I get you a precise answer.
Okay, and assuming that there is a plan, can Congress have all of that unredacted? Would you commit to that at this point?
Again, Congressman, I will happily take that back. And
Okay,
come
is
back
there
to
any
you with a
reason
specific
to
answer.
not provide Congress with an unredacted, complete plan, strategic plan? Is there some national security interest or some other concern where Congress couldn't have the oversight of that plan?
Congressman, I don't want to provide you with any inaccurate information, and I will take that back. And
We just like to have any information. Let me ask you this. The United States Attorney General established a procedure for educating felons on how to register to vote, how to vote by mail, those type of things. And as you probably know, there's a federal Bureau of Prisons, and federal felons are ineligible to vote. Why would we have a plan under Executive Order 14019 to educate these folks ineligible to vote on how to vote and how to proceed with that? Why would that be? Do you know?
Congressman, I would have to direct you to the Department of Justice for the specifics.
But you
around that. I'm not
oversee
familiar.
you oversee the rollout of these processes as one of the directors of OMB, right? So you have to be aware of that, right?
Congressman, on the specifics, I am very familiar with the Bureau of Prisons. The Bureau of Prisons was recently added to the high-risk list by GAO, focused on management issues associated with the Bureau of Prisons. We take all of the issues across the high-risk list very seriously, but on the specifics of that action, I would have to direct you to the Department of Justice.
You have to. So you're not going to do any oversight yourself on it. You're not going to look at what they're doing and inform Congress. You're not going to do any of that.
I'm happy to have my team follow up with yours on the specific concerns, and on the specific actions by DOJ, I would have to refer you to.
Okay. How about this one? What actions are you taking at OMB to ensure that people that are here illegally aren't eligible to vote under this executive order?
Congressman, again, I want to make sure that I give you a precise.
Do you know
answer. I want to
anything
take
about
that
this
back.
executive order at all?
I'm familiar with the executive order.
Okay, so that should be easy. What actions are you taking or have you taken in your office to ensure that people residing here illegally are ineligible to vote under the provisions rolled out by this administration under this executive order, knowing that they have to have a strategic plan submitted?
Congressman, I'm happy to take back your questions and your concerns and make sure I get you a precise answer. I'm happy to talk about my purview as management at OMB and the broad set of management priorities that we have been implementing.
Is there any reason at this point that you know of? Because we're here at the hearing, I get it, and maybe this is the first time you've been asked in public, but as you know, well, I hope you know, in Pennsylvania, 27 Pennsylvania legislators sued regarding this information. Now, they were found to not have standing, and of course, Article 1 says that the states determine the manner, time, and place of election. So I don't know who has standing if they don't have standing, but it seems to me that on time and time again in this occasion regarding this EO, that the plans remain unavailable to the public, unavailable to Congress. Why would that be?
Congressman, again, on the specifics here, I'm happy to take your concerns back. I want to make sure I provide.
Can you provide anything at all, any information whatsoever on this executive order today at this hearing?
I'm happy to talk about my broad management purview and the specific priorities that I've been focused on this.
And what are they?
Here.
What are those regarding this executive order, if you want to talk about that? Since
Again, it's not been a major focus of my time. I'm happy to take back your specific question.
that's the limit of what you can talk about regarding your involvement.
Congressman, I am happy to take back your question. I will make sure that we provide you with specific information.
Okay, last question, I promise. What's the timeline on the provision of these answers? What are we talking about? A week, 6 months? You know there's an election coming in November, so we'd like to have that in a timely manner so we can evaluate how well you're doing and if you're out of bounds. So what are we talking about?
I fully understand that. I am required, as part of this, to respond to your questions for the record as well, and I'm sure...
Timeline, sir. What's the time, for the love of God? Can you give me anything? 2 weeks? Give me something that you feel comfortable with, even if I don't like it.
Consistent with whatever Chairman Comer and we agree in terms of the questions for the record, that will be the timeline.
Well, we'd like them
soon. Can you commit to 2 weeks? Is 2
Mr.
weeks?
Chairman, we're now
Today,
over
tomorrow.
35 seconds.
I'll yield the balance.
Chair now recognizes, and we look forward to getting the answers soon. Chair now recognizes Mr. Frost from Florida for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nearly 3 million federal employees and 1.5 million privates. What's going on?
Frost. Okay, I'm sorry.
Mr. Conley.
I'm now advised about that. Mr. Conley from Virginia.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miller, what's your timeline for making sure Ukraine wins the war?
Again, Congressman, I'm happy to talk about the topics that are in my purview as the Deputy Director for the
that's not in your purview. Got it.
All right.
Then I won't belabor you with questions that are not relevant to your purview. Let me ask about federal pay. Every year, I, with my colleagues from a number of states, especially Maryland and Virginia, have introduced the FAIR Act. This year, we recommend a 7.2% increase for both military and civilian. I have to admit we were distressed that this year looks like we're going backwards instead of forward after some real progress in the Biden administration. Help us understand why you're only recommending 2% for federal employees when inflation's higher than that. And secondly, why you have, in fact, widened the gap between military and civilian compensation, which is something, pay parity has really been a goal we've had for a long time around here.
Congressman, thank you. Thank you for your broader leadership on our federal workforce. It has been important under the Biden administration that we are working to close the long-standing gap. Our FY25 budget had to comply with fiscal responsibility acts. We took that very seriously. We also wanted to make sure that our pay policy decisions were not having negative impacts on near-term service levels. We are currently several months into implementing the most recent pay increase, which is why we recommended the 2% pay increase as part of the FY25 budget.
Well, okay. I guess, I mean, when we looked at our analytics, there's no way we could have gotten to 2%. You know, and I hope we have an opportunity to dialogue about that, but I think that's just a very inadequate number for hardworking federal employees. So, as you know, we passed the FedRAMP legislation, which is the program, and we codified FedRAMP in law so that it's not just an orphan in the executive branch, and we worked well with your office as well as others in the executive branch. OMB drafted a modernized, a FedRAMP memo and solicited public comments, but that memo has not been finalized or issued. And as you might imagine, after dissolving the JAB, the Joint Authorization Board, and a number of companies that were sort of in process feel that they are now in limbo. And the whole point of trying to make the changes we made in law with respect to FedRAMP was to streamline and lower the cost and make it more predictable and reliable by having a presumption of adequacy that if you get approved in one federal window, it's pretty much good to go unless there's something very, very specialized. So when can we expect that memo? And do we have your commitment that in the spirit of the FedRAMP law we passed and the President signed, that we're going to do everything we can to meet the original goals of FedRAMP of 6 months, you know, reasonable cost and predictable
Yes, you have my commitment that we are hard work is underway to reform FedRAMP for the very reasons that you move forward with legislation for your ongoing leadership on this. You have my commitment that we will continue to make FedRAMP a priority and move expeditiously.
Good, because we care a lot about that. Final thing, in your purview, you chair the Security Clearance Sustainability and Credentialing Performance Accountability Council, a mouthful if there ever was one. One of the biggest complaints, certainly in my district, from federal contractors in intelligence, defense, and homeland security is how long it takes to A, get a security clearance, B, to even transfer it, which ought to be the low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, if you've already got one and you're going to move from company A to company B, it seems to me that ought to be easy. And yet, that also consumes a lot of time and a lot of bureaucracy. What can I tell companies in my district and people living in limbo with respect to the security clearance? Is there hope in the way? Are we going to get into that backlog? Are we going to streamline the process as we move forward?
Because of that mouthful, we refer to it as the PAC, to simplify.
Up here, PAC means something else. But all right.
The transformation effort, we believe, will result in meaningful reductions in the overall timelines. We put out those goals last year in terms of the reductions. We've had it at a stable place. The backlog's been at a stable place, and we've been making progress on the transfer of trust, the reciprocity, as you know, particularly at DOD, but we absolutely have more work to do.
All right, I'm going to hold you to it. And finally, I wrote you a letter about OMB's compliance with FATAR. We don't have a response yet. When might we expect that response?
I am aware of the letter. We will follow up with you expeditiously, and we'll give you clarity on a timeline quickly.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair now recognizes Dr. Fox from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Miller, for being here. I have several questions, so I'd like to try to get through as many of them as I can. The November 2023 revisions to OMB Circular A4 are a departure from the bipartisan and widely accepted practice and principles dating back to the Clinton era. The recent revision is little more than a thinly veiled attempt to stack the deck in favor of extremely costly new regulations. Why did the Biden administration feel the need to depart from the established bipartisan framework and guardrails for considering different regulatory approaches, seeking to give Americans an accurate representation of the true cost of new regulations?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. My purview is over our management apparatus, not our regulatory and information. What I will say is we take cost-benefit analysis very seriously. The intent of updating A4 was to update approaches that are used to modernize the way we do cost-benefit analysis to make sure that we're taking all of the costs and all of the benefits adequately when we're looking at regulation. Again, for specifics, I can come back to you. I don't oversee our regulatory.
Well, I have a follow-up. It seems to me that the OMB Circular A4 revisions are just a ploy to allow agencies to overstate the benefits and undercount the cost regulations that we all know will bankrupt Americans so long as they contain certain buzzwords like climate change and social cost of carbon. My concern is that this new framework will allow even more expensive regulations to be justified moving forward by, quote, offsetting them, end quote, with inflated so-called benefits. Can you tell me the total projected cost of new regulations and rules cleared by OMB in the last roughly 6 months since the Circular A4 was revised in November, and how does that figure compare to the 6-month period before the Circular A4 was revised?
Congresswoman, again, the regulatory and information activities of OMB aren't under my purview. It is, we take cost-benefit analysis very seriously, making sure that we're having the most accurate for both costs and benefits.
Well, this is a real specific question I'm asking you, so I will ask you to give me the information within a week, because it shouldn't be any problem to tell us, compare what I just said to you with the other time. So I'm going to ask you, Mr. Chairman, for that information within a week. One of the key points made in the Government Accountability Office's, or GAO, high-risk list is that the Office of Management and Budget is critical to addressing high-risk areas because of its role in leading and supporting agencies. How can Congress help OMB conduct more meaningful oversight to help improve high-risk programs?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And this is an area that I've been very focused on in partnership with GAO. I referenced a recent discussion that we had with the Bureau of Prisons, which is one of the newest issues added to the high-risk list. Our focus is making sure that there are two things happening on every single one of the high-risk list items. One, leadership attention. It is absolutely imperative that we have leadership attention in an area, making sure that leaders of relevant agencies, if we don't, that would be a shared interest of OMB and Congress to make sure that we have leadership attention on every single one of those, and that we're making positive progress everywhere we can. In GAO's last high-risk list report, they noted that we were making progress on 16 of the high-risk list areas, which they noted was the most in a 2-year period. We still have work to do, and I would like to do better than that.
Well, again, let me have a quick follow-up. OMB is one of the largest agencies that does not have an Office of Inspector General. What role do you think an Inspector General at OMB would play, and how would it help make OMB more accountable?
We have been very focused on the oversight community, both GAO and IGs. In late 2021, December of 2021, we issued guidance to all agencies on the importance of collaboration between agencies and IGs. That's been a hallmark effort of this administration.
Okay, one more question. I authored the GREAT Act, which set data standards for agency-driven data collection across the federal government. Can you tell me why each agency is left to its own devices to design its own grant application processes and post award forms without standardization, and are there efforts to standardize the grant application process across federal agencies?
Congresswoman, thank you for that. And this is a topic that has come up today and something that I appreciate your leadership on. We absolutely want to be moving towards a broader enterprise approach. We just overhauled our uniform grants guidance to drive that kind of consistency. We're pushing agencies to implement that guidance by the end of the fiscal year and to dramatically simplify their approaches to notices of funding opportunity for more consistency, especially for recipients that are receiving funds from multiple agencies.
Well, it's very important to our constituents all across the country that this be done. They are suffering as a result of your not doing that, and we need to do it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Miller, you quoted, I believe I'm going to quote you to, the hallmark of the Biden administration has been working with the oversight community. Could you bring within a week evidence of that? Because we haven't seen that on our end of it, especially with this committee. They've called votes, but we're going to try to get 2 more questioners in. Chair now recognize Mr. Frost from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nearly 3 million federal employees and 1.3 million private sector contractors hold security clearances that allow them to work with sensitive federal information and data. Each of these individuals underwent comprehensive and extensive background investigations to clear their credentials. Improving personal vetting and onboarding for the most sensitive government positions is key to our national security, especially when the legacy system is about 70 years old. So, Mr. Miller, in your role as chair of the Performance Accountability Council, spearheading the implementation of Trusted Workforce 2.0, can you briefly describe what Trusted Workforce 2.0 is?
Yes, thank you. And Trusted Workforce has been a project across multiple administrations, improving our overall personnel vetting system. It is a relook at how we do suitability and security clearance and a rebuild of the underlying system, standards, and approaches. One of the major changes, which we have implemented now for the entirety of the national security workforce, is to move away from a periodic reinvestigation model to a continuous vetting model. The result of that is that agencies identify potentially problematic information years faster. That's a significant shift. We have a lot of work still to go. We put out a quarterly report on our progress around the Trusted Workforce 2.0 effort. but it's really imperative that we deliver through our overall implementation.
Thank you. I was actually going to touch on the continuous vetting. And, we know in July 2021, not long after it was adopted, we heard about there was a defense counterintelligence and security agency that received an alert that somebody with security clearance was wanted in connection with an attempted murder. That individual was promptly removed, as we know, from security access, but if we had not had continuous vetting, they may have had access for another 5.5 years. While this instance demonstrates the system's potential, can you elaborate on how frequently such alerts have led to actionable intelligence since the program's inception?
I have been in discussions with agencies about their figures. I do not get into the specific personnel matters, but from our agencies, particularly our large agencies, they've seen meaningful increases in the number of alerts that has also required them to redo their business processes so that they can navigate through a different approach.
Roughly how many people in the federal government are still under the periodic review system where changes in their risk, could go unnoticed for about half a decade?
We have moved the national security sensitive workforce entirely into continuous vetting. Our next approach is to do the non-sensitive public trust population into continuous vetting. We're working to do that in the coming months.
Okay, thank you so much. According to GAO, construction of the National Background Investigation Services, the underlying IT system enabling Trusted Workforce 2.0, is several years behind schedule. Despite spending about $500 million on the NBIS system since 2016, DoD had neither developed a reliable schedule for completion of the project nor a reliable cost estimate for the total project. And unsurprisingly, DoD recently told congressional staff that NBIS is off schedule and over budget again. How exactly will OMB and the Performance Accountability Council get these reforms on track?
Thank you. And this has been an important focus. And late last year, DoD informed me in my role as chair of the PAC that they were now behind on new timelines. They reset their timelines in 2020 per the challenges with the earlier years. In my role as PAC, I directed DoD, ODNI, and OPM to provide responses on specific actions in 30, 60, and 90 days so that we can rebuild our schedule. I'm sure you're aware, DoD briefed staff that they have new leadership in place at DCSA, and this is their top priority. In my position as PAC chair, I plan to hold them accountable.
Do you buy that the new leadership, that the old leadership was the whole source of the problem, or have you identified other sources of the problem there?
Oftentimes within these large transformation efforts, there's inadequate technical talent. That's been a major focus of DoD, not just a leadership change, but bringing in more technical talent into the team to make sure that we're delivering.
Thank you. Reforming our decades-old security vetting system is crucial. We can't allow poor planning and project management to affect our nation's ability to improve security clearance vetting. I look forward to continuing this oversight work with my colleagues. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman.
Gentleman yields back, and our last questioner before we take a recess for votes will be Ms. Mace from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Got a little sidetracked by your answers, or actually non-answers, by Representative Perry this morning on EO 14019 about federal agencies, political appointees, specifically at federal agencies, and the electioneering that would be allowed under that executive order. Why do you choose not to answer his questions this morning?
Again, Congresswoman, I'm happy to take back specifics. This issue is not under my purview.
Do you believe that political appointees at federal agencies should be able to register voters and distribute mail-in ballots? Is that kind of electioneering constitutional, in your opinion?
I've been a political appointee now under 2 administrations.
Do you believe you should be registering voters, like federal agencies, political appointees at federal agencies should be allowed to register voters?
I've been a political appointee under 2 administrations, and we have very strict, clear restrictions on what we are allowed to do under the HACT Act.
Right, and is it constitutionally the power of elections and their oversight resides with the states, is that correct?
Again, I have restrictions.
The answer is yes there. Okay, so I have a few questions in the last 3.5 minutes that I have this morning. I know that there is an effort afoot, as you mentioned today, talking about federal jobs and requirements and the kinds of folks we need to hire in our federal workforce. There are thousands of vacant federal IT jobs, and the federal workforce has 4 times as many IT workers over the age of 60 than under the age of 30. Huge problem. One part of the solution, I believe, is more creative hiring, thinking outside of the box. So this particular committee has voted out multiple bills of mine in a almost unanimously, I think both times, totally unanimously, bipartisan way. And the bills that I have voted out of here, the MACE Act, H.R. 4502, which overwhelmingly passed actually out of the House last fall, also would waive and limit degree requirements for cybersecurity positions in federal government. And then just a couple weeks ago, we passed out of this committee H.R. 7887, the Access Act, which would do the same thing for federal contractors, federal contracts and their workers. So do you agree that these measures would be important to meeting our hiring goals for federal agencies in cyber?
First, I agree with you that we have a significant issue on IT. An approach that is more oriented towards skills-based hiring is absolutely the right approach that we should be taking.
I agree. We're doing it in the private sector. There's no reason why we can't do it in federal government. Would you support both the MACE Act and the Access Act and their passage and being signed into law?
I'm not familiar with all of the specifics, but I am we are very supportive of making sure that we have a more skills-based hiring approach and would welcome working with you on that.
Okay. We need to protect the critical data in federal computers, such as personally identifiable information of tens of millions of Americans. But a series of reports show that too many federal employees are lax in their password protection. In fact, 1 in 5, there was a study done to look at passwords, and 1 in 5 agency email accounts, 18,000 in total. Most commonly used password was password 1234, some with a hyphen, some without a hyphen. Hundreds of accounts were using these passwords. Is there any way to hold federal employees accountable for not using appropriate cyber hygiene and putting America's data at risk when their accounts get hacked?
We absolutely need to strengthen cyber hygiene, and one of the ways that OMB is focused on doing that is driving multi-factor authentication across all of the federal workforce.
Is that a requirement?
We are driving agencies to have multi-factor authentication across federal personnel.
Do you know what percentage of federal employees are doing multi-factor?
I don't have
agencies?
a specific number, but happy to follow.
When did you guys start doing that push?
In 2021, the president issued an EO on cybersecurity with a broad range of measures. Our responsibility was over federal systems. We issued guidance, what we call our zero trust strategy, that has been focused on a range of actions for agencies to take on endpoint detection, on monitoring, on multi-factor authentication. We've also built those strategies into our budget process, so we make sure that agencies have—
And then I have 30 seconds. Are there any consequences for federal employees that don't follow guidance when it comes to password protection, cybersecurity issues, et cetera?
All federal employees are accountable to their managers on a broad range of—
How are they held accountable then? How is that done?
I can't speak to the specifics of any individual action, but federal employees are responsible for following the guidance of their agencies and their—
But then when they don't, what happens?
I don't want to speak to a hypothetical about a specific situation, but our expectation is that agencies are moving forward on improving their cyber hygiene and on multi-factor authentication.
But do you get reports back on how many federal employees are following guidance in cyber hygiene, like the numbers?
I don't want to give you an imprecise answer, but I'd be happy to follow up.
But are you getting reports at least?
Our OMB office monitors performance across agencies on things like multi-factor authentication, yes.
Okay, thank you, and I yield back.
Pursuant to the previous order, the chair declares the committee in recess, subject to the call of the chair. We plan to reconvene 10 minutes after the last vote. The committee stands in recess.
Specifics here are not under my purview. I've not focused my time on issues that are not under my purview.
For the moment, I'm just asking you, are you aware of any sort of office buzz that anything's being done on this? Are the reports being done? Is the OMB office in general working? Have you in meetings heard cross-pollination of any sort of conversations related to this executive order?
I'm not familiar with specific activities. It's not under my purview. I haven't spent my time on this.
Okay, that's fine. Seems hard to believe. But moving on to something that definitely is under your purview. Last year, the Government Accountability Office released a report showing that during the first 3 months of 2023, 17 out of 24 agencies studied were using their buildings at 25% capacity due to telework policies. Is that still the case? Have you made progress on getting people back to work?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, we've made progress. Agencies are implementing. That data shows two issues. One is where agencies were in implementing updated telework policies and longstanding challenges we have with having too much real estate within the federal government, an issue that existed long before this administration. With regards to where we are right now, in April of 23, so after that data, we directed agencies to take steps to substantially increase their in-person presence, to reflect their mission space, organize that around making sure that they're performing where there's similarities, where we have office workers, so we refer to it as headquarters and equivalents in our guidance, that they're achieving at least 50% in time with their ability to adjust accordingly. We're making progress. Agencies are still implementing.
Okay. I mean, for most of America, 50% would still seem like a low mark. I mean, granted, that would be progress compared to 25%. Yeah, and you do mention, like, maybe the buildings are too big for the right size. You know, in the private sector, we look at telework as, okay, you're going to maybe take a hit on productivity, but you're going to gain on, you know, you won't need the office space, and so you'll save money there, you know, and kind of how a business, but we never seem to see that same ROI when it comes to the, like, we don't have agencies coming to us and saying, well, we don't need this building anymore, or we don't need this office space, so we can reduce our budget here to make up for it there. So I would just encourage you to continue to work on that. Along those lines, it was reported that President Biden's chief of staff had to personally exhort cabinet secretaries to get their employees back to the office to just 50% of the time. Are we at 50% yet, or how's that going?
So about half of the federal workforce can't telework because of their job responsibilities. Our guidance was focus on office workers. Where we are and what we've directed agencies to do is to monitor by hours. So what is the share of hours that are in person? Where we are for the federal government overall, again, half of our workforce can't telework due to their job responsibilities. Where we are overall is about 80% based upon the discussions that we've had with agencies to date.
Okay. The architect of the Capitol's Inspector General recently found 8% of telework eligible employees were getting improper locality pay, wasting hundreds of thousands of tax dollars. Is this occurring at AOC? Or if it is, you would think it's also happening at other agencies as well. How many federal employees have had their telework agreements revoked for misconduct, fraud, or other improper behavior, or simply poor performance?
Right. So for federal agencies, I think the specific issue you are speaking to is around appropriate locality pay, or whether or not people are following their telework agreements. Each individual employee should have a telework agreement. They're responsible for upholding that. My expectation is agency leaders are holding them accountable to the telework agreements that they've signed. Similarly, if they've taken action where individuals are not in a consistent place with the locality that they should be in, agencies need to fix that. I'm not aware of this being a widespread issue.
I can appreciate you expecting that the work would be done, but, you know, it's been said, President Reagan, trust but verify. I've heard someone say, unless you inspect what you expect, you won't get what you expect. So I think it's important that you be well aware of where we are on this. One of the things that we've seen in DHS, for example, 336 individuals applied for COVID-19 relief funds while also continuing to be employed. So they were getting unemployment benefits while continuing to be employed and actually receiving overtime pay. And this is, we've heard stories of like this through the IRS and those kind of things. How many employees have been held accountable to that, have fired for basically essentially stealing from the taxpayer? What kind of accountability metrics have been put in place to not only make sure this doesn't happen again, but make sure that those who've done this are not in positions of public trust?
I'm not aware of the specifics of the DHS example that you cited. Federal employees absolutely are responsible for upholding the law, and they should be held accountable if they don't.
We agree that they should be. The question is, we don't hear that they are being held accountable. So my question to you is, do you know of cases where people are being fired for essentially defrauding the American people?
fraud during the pandemic was a challenge that we face. I'm not familiar with the specifics of the DHS case. My expectation is that we also have inside of agencies, IGs, looking into issues such as that, and agencies should.
Yeah, a lot of this information comes from the IG reports, and the story we're getting is that nothing's being done to provide disciplinary action. So I'm asking you to, you know, if there has been, and certainly could you look into that?
I'm happy to look into those cases.
Thank you very much. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Ms. Presley from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Miller, for joining us today. I want to take a moment to discuss the critical importance of DEI work. Colleagues across the aisle have waged an all-out war on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm not sure if it's that they just hate one aspect of it, like diversity, or if it's the combination of all three. Regardless, this Republican majority has demonstrated it's out of touch with the priorities of everyday people and has focused its effort on passing legislation and budgets to undermine DEI and entrench systemic discrimination against people of color, folks with disabilities, and other marginalized groups. Republicans sought to defund the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, which is essential to confronting the rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia impacting our students. Republicans voted to stop the hiring of DEI personnel in the military, despite evidence that it will improve military readiness. And Republicans consistently use harmful rhetoric at every opportunity to undermine the talent, knowledge, skills, and the training of professionals in every sector where DEI initiatives exist. And they often pervert, mischaracterize, and weaponize the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., despite the fact that his children, his surviving children, have repeatedly asked them to cease and desist from doing so. It is no surprise that the same people complaining about DEI are the same people who complained about the Me Too movement, about Black Lives Matter, about the ERA, about the gay rights movement, and so much more. The fact that as soon as someone who is Black or gay has a disability earns a promotion, Republicans complain that they are unqualified and begin ranting about how diversity, equity, and inclusion is ruining the country. It's shameful. It's untrue, it's discriminatory, and we must not back down in our efforts to create a nation that respects all people. Might I add that the opposition is majority overwhelmingly white and male. Now, President Biden signed a historic executive order on his first day in office to take a whole-of-government approach that embodies equity in the administration's work to ensure all people benefit, not just the wealthy and well-connected. Mr. Miller, the Office of Management and Budget plays an outsized role in implementing and overseeing the executive orders on equity. Can you explain why equity is an important part of performance goals for agencies?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And there was a phrase that you used that is central to explaining it, is that government should work for all Americans. So one example of something that we are doing is around accessibility associated with government services. We have many government digital websites and services where it's hard for some people, including disabled individuals, to access those government services, and we're working to improve that. Our services aren't working if they're not serving all of America.
Very good. I agree. What is an example of how President Biden's executive order on equity has helped folks across the country?
Well, one of the things that we have done is to broaden and discussed in this hearing the way in which we are utilizing federal financial assistance to reach more broadly into communities, to improve performance of the dollars, to make sure that community-based organizations that might otherwise not have applied for federal funds are able to access those funds and better deliver because they're closer to those in their community. That means better results, that means more efficiency, and frankly, that means less waste on useless overhead.
Thank you. The executive order, this is truly a first of its kind. I'm proud to partner with Ranking Member Raskin on legislation to codify key aspects into law so that they will exist in perpetuity. The truth is that America needs DEI to disrupt systems of oppression that are active in every facet of our society. DEI initiatives are how we combat white supremacy, anti-Semitism, ableism, sexism, transphobia, and more. In the face of this opposition, I applaud those who are committed to doing this work, from college presidents, corporate executives, to community organizers and academic researchers, and to those who are against DEI. I would love to know really what you are so afraid of. What are you so threatened by? Thank you. I yield.
Gentlelady yields. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Miller, Chairman Sessions and I sent you a letter in January asking for documents and information around both telework and your healthy workplaces guidance. Your response did not include any of the documents we requested. Understanding how agencies are measuring their performance is important for the committee's oversight, as is understanding how their return to work plans are progressing. When we spoke yesterday, you expressed a willingness to share that information with us. I'd like for you to confirm that for the record today, that you'll work with us on getting that information. I know lots of other members have asked the same question, so I'll ask it again on the record. Will OMB provide the committee the plans and relevant information agencies have provided pursuant to OMB's Healthy Workplaces guidance with the committee?
Chairman Comer, thank you. We are currently in the process of collecting updated information from agencies to develop a report for the Appropriations Committee as directed by FY24 appropriations legislation. That will include,
that's it. Okay.
Yes, that will include telework policies and more.
Going back to telework, and you can see the frustration on our side of the aisle, because we don't believe the federal government is any more efficient or productive with its new wide open telework policy. We don't even know what the telework policy is. We just know that there's a significantly higher percentage of the federal workforce that's working from home as opposed to working in the office. Now, if you can prove to us through data that it's more efficient, then we'll accept that, but we'll start selling off unnecessary federal properties. That's something that Mayor Bowser strongly agrees with us as well. So one of the things that we've noticed is that President Biden and his chief of staff have called for agencies to get back to working within the office, but it doesn't appear the federal employees are adhering to the president's policy. So why has it been so difficult for the Biden administration to get workers back in the office?
Chairman, we share the goal of making sure that we have a data-oriented approach. That's why we had a whole...
But you agree they're not, I mean, there's still a lot more people that aren't coming into the office that I think every agency would hope would come into the office, right?
We have set a standard for office workers that are where there's comparability, and agencies are still implementing, which means
what's taken so long? My God, COVID's been over 2 years, 3 years.
We have, and you noted this in terms of communication, pushing on agency leadership.
Is it a weak president? I mean, if the president says for them to come back to work and they don't come back to work, I mean, why are the civil servants disobeying the orders of the President of the United States?
Yeah, Chairman Comer, as you know, about half of our federal workforce already has to be at the work site and has been at the
Are they?
due to their
Are they?
Due to their job responsibilities every single day. Our expectation is that agencies are monitoring. Our expectation is also that agencies are
Do you have data to support that? Because I don't think they're coming to work. And that's what our sources tell us. We don't feel the government, you know, if you talk to any caseworkers, the people in our staff, on our staffs that do the work, they have had significant difficulty getting people on the phone at the VA, at the IRS, at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and the agencies go on and on, Medicare. It appears that's because they have a lot of their workforce still working from home. They're doing what they want. They're not obeying the directive of the President of the United States. And I don't think you have any data after all this time to prove they're coming back to work. You sure don't have any data that shows it's a better deal to the taxpayers. We all work for the taxpayers, whether we're in Congress or whether you work for the federal government. We work for the taxpayers of America, and the taxpayers aren't getting their money's worth. No one says we're totally opposed to telework. We just want to see data that shows it's more efficient. And I don't think you all have that data. I don't think you've tried to get the data, because I don't think there's a willingness by this administration to want to alienate the federal workforce. That's not a good deal for the American taxpayers. So we've asked this information. You say you're compiling it. With all due respect, you should have already compiled it, and we should know exactly what percentage of the workforce is working from home, and we should also know whether or not that's provided more efficiency and effectiveness for the American taxpayer, which I don't think it has, but we'd like to see that data. And I've used all of my time on this, but we're very frustrated with that. And then with respect to Schedule F, I have to say this, one of the problems that a new administration often encounters is they come in and you know, if you talk about energy policy with the EPA, that's going to be an issue in this presidential election. If we change administrations, we're going to have a significantly different energy policy in America. But if you have federal workforce that doesn't comply with the will of the American people, with the mandate that the American people have given a new administration, they continue to restrict drilling, restrict fracking, oppose any type of fossil fuel, then that isn't a good deal for the American people. The American people aren't getting what they voted for at the ballot. And we have a lot of federal employees that spend all their time obstructing a new administration's policy directives, an administration elected by the people. So we believe Schedule F is a good deal for the American people, for the taxpayer. So I just want to throw that in there. Do you all have another question? If not, I'll recognize Mr. Timmons for 5 minutes. Mr. Timmons from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for holding this hearing today, and I want to thank the Deputy Director from OMB for being here today. I'm going to talk about debt. I ran for Congress 6 years ago, and I remember the line I used. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs in 2010 said, testified before Congress, that the #1 national security threat facing the United States was our inability to spend within our means, Congress's inability to spend within its means. At the time in 2010, this is kind of shocking, our debt was $13.5 trillion. Today, our debt is almost $35 trillion. We have a $1.8 trillion deficit annually, and we're adding $1 trillion in debt to our debt every 100 days. It is just entirely unsustainable, and while Congress has to solve some of these problems, I do believe that OMB can lead in some of these areas. So I'm going to talk about a bill that I sponsored with a friend of mine from Washington, Representative Kilmer. It was H.R. 7331, the Improving Government for America's Taxpayers Act, and it requires GAO to submit a report annually on the estimated cost savings of its unimplemented recommendations and report on high-risk areas for waste, fraud, and abuse and mismanagement. And OMB has a huge role in this. I mean, y'all are leading the charge to try to root out waste, fraud, and abuse and save taxpayer dollars. So this bill was signed into law in December of 2022 as a part of the fiscal year 2023 NDAA. And so I guess my question to you is, are you aware of this GAO program, the high-risk area program, to try to save money?
Are you speaking to the specific report or to the high-risk list that
The high-risk list that, I mean, technically OMB is has a huge leadership role in implementing those recommendations.
Yes, and in my role, I work closely with GAO, with the Comptroller General and his team on all of the high-risk list areas. We convene all of the relevant agencies. In some case, we are the relevant agency on making sure that we are making meaningful improvements. In GAO's most recent high-risk list report, they noted that there was more improvement over the prior 2 years on high-risk list items than there's ever been.
That's great. We got to keep going in that direction. Would you agree that debt is one of the biggest challenges facing our country?
The President believes deeply in fiscal responsibility and put forward a budget. Director Young was here in front of House Budget testifying on his approach, on the President's approach.
Okay. Do you know of any steps that are being taken to address the high-risk areas that you were referencing? Specifically, or just you are generally aware of the program and the efforts?
Yes, I work with GAO on bringing together our team at OMB, the GAO team, and the agencies on each of the high-risk areas to make sure that we have visibility on whether they're making progress. And importantly, one of the areas I'm particularly committed to is making sure that we have leadership attention on every single one of the high-risk list areas, because without leadership attention, we're not going to get progress.
Could you talk me through how is that siloed into the, like, who in your agency is tasked with which areas of the high-risk list? How does that work?
So the Comptroller General and I convene what we call tripartite meetings. That was something that had been done under previous administrations. It was something I committed to during my confirmation hearings in early 2021. We've worked through the vast majority of those within OMB, both the management team and the resource management offices that oversee individual agencies participate in those so that we're monitoring progress. GAO has a rating system, a 5-point rating system. Leadership attention is one of the 5 items in order to move things off of the high-risk list. So the combination of GAO oversight and OMB working closely with agencies is how we've approached high-risk list areas.
Thank you for that. Is there an opportunity to use technology, perhaps even AI, to try to further increase savings?
I think there is real opportunity for AI. We're committed to making sure that we're doing that responsibly, including on tackling things like fraud. We have opportunities. There was an analytics center that was created by the PRAC, the oversight body for pandemic relief. We believe maintaining that analytics center across the federal government will enable us to use better analytics and the possibility for AI to look into that data so we can identify risks and reduce and prevent fraud.
Thank you for that. The federal government is going to have to do more with less. We have to get our spending under control, and we got to grow the economy to create additional tax revenue to pay our way out of the debt that we're under. I appreciate all that you're doing to help save taxpayer dollars. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Timmons. And at this point, I will recognize myself, which I always think is kind of weird, because if I was looking at a mirror, I'd go, hey, there's Tim Burchett. And I go, yeah, that's me. And then I'd recognize myself, but I'm not doing that. Mr. Miller, does the Office of Management and Budget comply with the executive order on promoting access to voting?
Congressman, again, a number of your colleagues have asked this question to me. This isn't.
I know they always ask the number. They always give you whatever the 5-digit number, and I'm like, who's going to remember the dadgum number?
I appreciate that. Again, this is an issue that is not under my purview. I will take this back to OMB, and I will make sure that we have a response to you.
Okay, and I would like in that response to provide. I want you to keep track of how many members it helps to register. And I want the details on showing the locations, the precincts that are targeted, whether they're rural or urban, and what states or cities that you all are doing that in. Can you do that?
I understand your request. Again, this is not an issue that's been under my purview.
Okay, but it is under the department, is that correct?
I'm not familiar with the specific activities. It's not under my purview. To the extent we are directed actions under the EO, we will absolutely provide a response to you.
Okay. Also, how does your office, the Management and Budget, reduce improper payments and fraud across the federal government?
Congressman, thank you. On this topic, this is a major focus, particularly in 2021, when at the beginning of this administration, we came in amidst the pandemic, major challenges still in the economy, and we're implementing a set of relief programs, some of which we had inherited from 2020. There was historic levels of fraud in our pandemic relief programs. They provided critical relief, but there were also not basic controls put in place in 2020 that would have allowed us to do things to prevent the fraud while enabling timely implementation. We took steps to reinstate basic controls. The 3 main programs that experienced that fraud were PPP and EIDL at SBA, and UI programs, which are state administered but overseen by the Department of Labor. Things like utilizing the do not pay list at the Department of Treasury. Things like making sure that businesses have their tax transcripts so that we know that they are, in fact, real businesses. The President's also put forward in 2023 a comprehensive anti-fraud proposal that would both provide the resources for inspectors general and the Department of Justice to go after the guys who took advantage of these programs, and also implement additional steps to prevent fraud going forward. We believe with the combination of the steps that we have taken, including bringing the IGs in on the front end of program design and the President's anti-fraud proposal, we could have prevented a substantial portion of the fraud that occurred. We should never be in that situation where our systems are not prepared. And I think this should be an issue that we can work together on to make sure that we're taking the steps and learning the lessons from those pandemic relief programs to strengthen our systems going forward.
In your opinion, what agencies are most prone to the waste, fraud, and abuse?
What we saw inside of the pandemic were the 3 programs I mentioned at SBA and the UI programs. In part, the UI program, you had state systems that were overwhelmed. Their systems weren't able to keep up with the sizable number of individuals applying, and they didn't have adequate controls on the front end. This is also an area where we report. We are pushing on agencies to strengthen their analysis around improper payments and annually re-release improper payments in major programs, both the level and rate for those major programs.
What are the resources that are available to you all as far as the federal agencies? And are the agencies all aware of these resources?
I'm sorry, could you clarify the question?
Yeah, the government-wide resources that are available to federal agencies to reduce the risk of improper payments and frauds.
Yes, so one of the key resources that we've been working to build up is the do not pay list at the Treasury Department. That has meant us putting more data into it. So for example, we have made the full Death Master file available in the do not pay list. This was a story that was in 2020 where certain checks were going out to individuals that were deceased because we didn't have updated data in the programs that could identify who had recently passed away. Strengthening the do not pay list is something that we want to do going forward and make sure that we're utilizing more broadly across programs.
Okay, my time is just about up. I would remind the members that I had just had a conversation with the chairman about a situation at GW where the students felt threatened and they felt like they were in danger, and the school asked for police presence there, and the mayor turned them down. We're asking the chairman if we can have a hearing on that tomorrow or in the next few days to get to the bottom of that. So I just putting the members on notice. That was actually brought to me by a friend of mine across the aisle. So it's a bipartisan issue. Next, we'll recognize Representative Goldman. Is he here? Oh, no, Representative Crockett. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just going by the list that was up here.
Thank you so much. Before I begin my officially prepared remarks, there were some questions posed to you specifically about debt. And there seemed to be a concern about the mounting debt. And I am going out on a limb, and I am going to ask you if you are aware of how much debt we added under the Trump administration, out of curiosity. If you don't know, I know off the top of my head, but something tells me you may know.
I have an imprecise number. I bet you have the precise number in front of you, so I don't want to give you the imprecise number if you have the precise.
No. Give me the imprecise.
No, please.
Well, I'm going off of my head because that wasn't part of what I was supposed to say. But long story short, $8 trillion was added under the Trump administration. And so I think that it is important that we focus on making sure that we're keeping our debt under control, but I think it's also important that we're honest about how that debt is accrued and make sure that we don't continue to make the same mistakes. I know that the election was brought up, and there are those that are standing by their man, but they also seem to be concerned about debt, which seems like the two don't go together, because we know that their man actually is really good at running up the credit card debt for this country, because he likes to give tax breaks to his very rich friends, which means that we don't get as much money coming through the door when they are not required to pay their fair share. So I just wanted to make sure that we put that out there first and foremost. I recently was appointed to the Weaponization Subcommittee,
And so I'm going to have plenty of long days ahead of me, kind of like what I have here on oversight. But the point of the Weaponization Committee was to have a conversation about the government being weaponized in a way so that people could somehow get some personal gain, because there's this theory that this administration has somehow weaponized the government. There is not this acknowledgement that the other guy just is a criminal, because that's just too hard to believe, even though he currently is sitting in New York facing criminal charges that were not brought by the federal government, but instead by state government. Nevertheless, so when I think about weaponization, I honestly can only think about Trump and his administration and all the work that he did to harm federal employees. So to be clear, Trump's 2020 executive order would have effectively gutted civil service job protections for workers across the federal government. Trump would have created politically charged firings of potentially thousands of federal workers and made these public servants subject to the whims of a political dictator and his posse rather than the adherence of the tenets of our Constitution. So let's be clear. Individuals pursuing public service do so largely because of their belief in government. I'm sure you can make a lot more money if you just decided to go elsewhere in private industry. A lot of us could, honestly. But if this rule is implemented, it would destroy the little bit of foundation and structure public servants still have that allowed them to put people over politics. How do I know this? Because Trump and his Republican lackeys stated they felt nonpartisan bureaucrats were hampering Trump's policies, and he wanted to, quote, shatter the deep state. In fact, President Donald Trump's personnel chief, John McEntee, told agency officials at a meeting to implement staffing changes and movements across the government. Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter into the record an article from Axios stating that Mr. John McEntee, a 29-year-old at the time, a former body man to Trump, who was fired in 2018 by then Chief of Staff John Kelly, but then rehired and promoted to head the Presidential Personnel Office, directed staff to identify anti-Trumpers and stated that they will no longer get promotions and will be shifted around agencies.
Without objection.
Thank you so much. Now, Mr. Miller, can you tell us how the implementation of Schedule F would impact the morale and performance of all federal employees?
Thank you, Congresswoman. This is a critical issue and a critical question. In the first week in office, President Biden canceled Schedule F. This is real for OMB. The vast majority of our staff in 2020 was being considered to move to Schedule F. I think this would have a debilitating impact on the basic performance of federal agencies. We already have a system where 3,000 different roles are for political appointees. Those political appointees are in leadership and decision-making roles overseeing their agencies. If we were to go down the path that you outlined, where there were arbitrary or political decisions made instead of decisions made around expertise and experience, it would deeply harm the institutional knowledge in our agencies, but it would also deeply harm our ability to recruit talent going forward into organizations that we want to organize around performance.
Thank you so much for your answer, and I absolutely agree. My mother has worked in I don't know how many federal agencies since I was a little girl in elementary school, and I promise you, we have changed from Democrats to Republicans to MAGA, back to all the things. But I can tell you that she is so very qualified to do her work, and this would be devastating. Thank you so much, and I yield.
Thank her for her service.
Gentlelady yields. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Thanks for being here, Mr. Miller. So every year, the federal government obligates more than $1 trillion in federal financial assistance. Some go to grants, some go to cooperative agreements, other direct appropriations or property donations. I'm trying to understand grants. If you can help me with grants.
Yes.
How many of those in dollars? How much of that is going to grantees?
Of the $1.2 trillion?
Yeah.
I don't have the precise breakdown between grants and other forms of federal financial assistance.
Would that be possible for you guys to grab and get to me?
I'd be happy to follow up with you on specifics.
Great, thank you. And I'm thinking that there might be as many as 40,000 recipients. I would like to know the number of recipients as well.
We can get back to you on the specifics there as well.
Very good. And the reason I'm going that way is because I want to know a couple of things. Are these grants pursuant to administrative regulatory creation, or are they statutory animals?
Our programs are operating under statutory, under statutes. So federal financial assistance programs, there's a wide array of them.
But I'm focusing specifically on grants, not necessarily financial assistance benefits or that type of thing.
Right.
So grantees, and so the grant programs, it's my understanding, some are statutorily created, others are created through bureaucratic rulemaking that they believe that they've been delegated authority on. I'm trying to get a breakdown on that. Is that possible for you to get for us?
Be happy to take back your question, make sure that we have a response. And some grants are by formula.
Sure.
Some grants are competitive grants in nature. All of these programs have the statutory authority to move forward on their federal financial assistance.
So on pages 6 and 7 of your testimony, you talk about some of the anti-fraud measures that have been put in place, and those seem to focus on the benefits that are being given as opposed to grants. And I'm wondering, what kind of measures do you guys have? Because OMB has actually indicated that there is waste, perhaps even in the grant program. And so I'm trying to understand, do you have the same mechanism in place to recover money from grantees that have perhaps defrauded or gotten outside of their lane?
So we recently announced an overhaul to our uniform grants guidance. We worked with the Inspector General community on that, so that by simplifying the guidance, we made it easier for inspectors general to do their jobs and identify areas of waste, fraud, and abuse. One specific that I would note is...
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't want to cut you off, but there is another area I want to get into. So I would love any additional details that you might want to send memo form to us that I would include as part of the record, if that would be possible, Mr. Miller.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So since the Hamas attacks on Israel of October 7th, there have been reports of federal employees calling for walkouts. Federal employees have also been circulating open letters, albeit anonymously, voicing strong opposition to the president's policies in Gaza. Federal employees have First Amendment rights. I recognize that, the same as every American does. But they can't strike. And with that in mind, what, if any, action has been taken to identify federal employees who engage in illegal job actions in protest against the president's policies in Gaza?
Chair, I understand, or Congressman, I understand the question and the concern. I'm not familiar with specific actions that were taken.
Is there a way you could...
Agencies should have procedures in place to make sure that their employees are complying with their responsibilities, including some of the responsibilities you noted.
So would you be able to find out if there are policies in place and if there's been any action based on those policies for us?
I'm happy to take that back, yes.
Yeah, thank you. And so when you take it back, as everybody up here knows, everybody tells us, we'll take it back and we'll get back with you. I'd like to ask you if there's maybe in a couple weeks we can get an answer to these questions that I've been posing to you. Is that acceptable?
Yes.
Great. And additionally, would like to know more about anything related to any kind of these employee actions. So look forward to hearing from you, Mr. Miller. And with that, I'm going to yield back the balance of my time, and I'm going to recognize for a closing statement.
Mr. Chairman, before we do that...
Oh, Ms. Stansbury's gotten.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, didn't realize that.
Yeah, before she goes, could I just
you got some
submit for you?
Yes.
Article from the Washington Business Journal called "The Benefits of Project Labor Agreements, Along with the Myths." An article from the Economic Policy Institute called "Project Labor Agreements on Federal Construction Projects Will Benefit Nearly 200,000 Workers," and an article on project labor agreements and community workforce agreements from the Center on American Progress.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you. And I now recognize for 5 minutes the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Stansbury.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Miller. It's wonderful to have you here today. As a proud OMB alum and former civil servant serving in this great nation's government of ours, I'm especially happy to have the final word here in the committee before closing statements. I served at OMB between 2011 and 15, and I was a program examiner in the OMB Interior Branch. So it's wonderful to be able to be on this side and to say thank you to all all of your staff, and of course to anyone who's watching back in the EEOB or the NEOB. Hi, friends. I want to just take a few moments to talk about the importance of the civil service and the attacks that we saw in the previous administration. As you are well aware, in October of 2020, then President Trump issued an executive order that sought to turn our federal workforce into partisan loyalists. Thankfully, Democrats in Congress worked to prevent implementation, and the Biden-Harris administration revoked this order almost immediately when they came into office. But it went far beyond that executive order. We saw during the Trump administration that across the federal service, there were heads of agencies and departments that were moved within the SES bands, and whole agency headquarters were moved to different cities and states with the intention of trying to get civil servants to quit their jobs because they couldn't fire them. It was a massive disruption to the federal workforce. Thousands of people left their jobs, and part of why we're still struggling under the current administration to catch up on so many vital services is because of the actions that were taken. And I know, Mr. Miller, you're serving in a political role, but talk to us about the importance of our civil service. What is their role within the federal government, and why is it so crucial that political appointees don't serve in every single role that the federal government does?
Thank you, and thank you for your service at OMB. We're proud of all of our alumni. The effective performance of our organizations, this is true in public and private sector, is based on having strong teams and strong culture. Within the federal government, we have a 140-year tradition of a nonpartisan service system based on merit, that we look at people's skills, their expertise, and their experience. We want to cultivate that irrespective of what their personal views are. We want our teams to bring that to the office every day. I know as a leader and a manager, I want a team that gives me their very best, that gives me their real views, even if those views are in disagreement with my own, because I want the best advice in making decisions about what we need to do going forward. We have 3,000 different roles where we have political appointees fill them in leadership positions across agencies. They are responsible for setting the agenda, for leading those agencies, for ultimately being the decision makers. But the institutional knowledge and the expertise of our civil servants is critical to the well-functioning of our government, whether that's providing good customer experience at a call center or that's delivering relief after a disaster. Having our civil servants know that they are there based on their merit is critical to well-performing organizations, irrespective of who is in the White House.
Thank you. And, I would add to that, not only are they kind of the heart and soul of these institutions themselves, they're the institutional memory as well as the folks who know the law and compliance with the law. And, I left OMB in 2015, as I said, and then went to the Hill before I moved home. And I was struck during the Trump administration when some colleagues of mine who were civil servants within OMB were raising alarm bells about nefarious actions that were happening with politicals under the Trump administration. And in fact, months before the news broke, I was hearing from folks that the politicals at OMB were trying to use apportionments to violate the Budget Control Act, basically to withhold aid to Ukraine. Now, there's probably no one in this room except for me and you and the staff sitting behind you that know what an apportionment is, and that's because that's the institutional memory and functioning of how OMB releases funds that are appropriated by Congress. So if we need any example of why we need a civil service, how about following the law and making sure that no U.S. president ever again can violate the law and withhold aid to a foreign ally in its efforts to try to hold back an adversarial nation. I mean, this is literally global democracy on the line. So I appreciate your service. I appreciate the service of all of our colleagues. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. And now for a closing statement, I recognize the ranking member for 2 minutes, Mr. Raskin.
Thank you very kindly, Mr. Chairman. I just want to clean up a couple of matters that may be hung over from prior questioning. One about project labor agreements. Those are only for federal contracts and federal projects, and they've been enormously successful in setting wages and benefits for workers and creating good employer-employee relations. So for the life of me, I don't understand the nature of that attack. I want to echo my distinguished colleague from New Mexico about this whole effort in the last administration and by a current candidate for president to basically ravage the civil service by replacing professional civil servants and experts with political flunkies. And to give another example, the gentlelady gave the example of what happened in Ukraine. I want to give a closer to home example of what happened with Hurricane Dorian, when the scientists at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the National Weather Service, made predictions about where the hurricane was going to hit on the East Coast. And President Trump decided that the hurricane was really going to hit in Alabama. And that was just contradicted by the facts. And NOAA continued to put out notices to the public saying, no, that Alabama was not at serious risk for being a target, and it was going to be on the coast and much further south. And then Trump got very mad about that, and he got the Secretary of Commerce to go after them and so on. And this is really what we're talking about. Do you want the federal government filled with a bunch of political flunkies, hacks, and sycophants who will say whatever the president wants, or do you want professional scientists and civil servants who are going to follow facts and follow the law? The president's job is to take care that the law is faithfully executed, not that the law is disrupted and remade in his own royal image. And so if you want a government that is going to be letting Donald Trump and his Sharpie determine where the hurricane's going to hit, as opposed to scientists, then you would be for Schedule F. But we view Schedule F as a serious danger to the professional civil service that's been built up over the last several decades. So, Mr. Chairman, I mean, I've got some comments on some of the other things that were said, but we agreed to just 2 minutes, so I'm happy to yield back to you. So.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. And now I recognize myself for 2 minutes on closing. I just want to talk about a couple issues. One was raised by the gentlelady from Texas. I'm talking about the national debt. Well, according to the U.S. Treasury, over the past 366 days, total national debt has increased by $3.1 trillion. Held by the public, debt held by the public has increased by $2.84 trillion, and intergovernmental debt by $265 billion over that same period of time. I think that's important to go. And I would just say, when you start talking about political junkies, hacks, and sycophants, we don't want to see that. Yeah, I don't disagree. But you know where we see that in abundance? On the border. On the border and the people who are imposing the border security policy, which is why we have a wide open border. Encourage my colleagues to get down there as often as I do. Just down there again last week. We'll be down there again next week. So Schedule F was mentioned earlier in the hearing, and OPM recently issued a final rule which seems like it was an attempt to prevent President Trump from reissuing Schedule F should he win another term. Opponents of Schedule F like to talk about politicization of the federal workforce, but from our perspective, that has already happened. And surely reports of federal employees organizing at the beginning of the last administration to plan how to block President Trump's policies have to be concerning. They are to us. The fact is, certain federal employees have an ever-increasing amount of power to decide what does and does not happen with respect to an administration's policies. Earlier, telework was mentioned as an example of civil servants thinking they can do what they want. An unaccountable civil service is just as dangerous to our country as a patronage system. So with all that said, we need something like Schedule F to ensure the people we elect are able to do what they were elected to do, and that's why we support Schedule F. We've had a good hearing today. Appreciate you being here. Director Miller, thank you, and appreciate all the members that came and those who came and sat in the gallery and the staff that helped. With that, we're adjourned.